Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer collectively spent $1,342 million trying to win the Democratic nomination, and the two men served as textbook examples of just how much money is in our political system.
Indeed, and as friend of the show, Zaid Jilani writes in The Correspondent, the donor class's viewpoints do not line up with what the average American actually supports. Zaid specifically cites a UC Berkeley study showing that Republican voters are more in favor of higher taxes for the wealthy compared to their donors. Zaid joins us now to expand on that and also the findings on the Democratic side. Great to see you, Zaid.
Yeah, great to be here.
Good to see you, man.
So just lay out the results of this study, because this is so fascinating.
Yeah, so UC Berkeley political scientist David Brockman and Stanford University's Neil Malhotra, basically what they did is they used an original sample of what are called partisan donors. Those are donors who give overwhelmingly to one political party. So people who give exclusively to Democrats, people who give exclusively to Republicans. And what they did is they sampled them kind of on their points of view around a variety of issues, and then they compared that to samples of points of view of the voters for those two parties, like strong partisans who are Democrats or Republicans. And it's really interesting. They found large kind of average differences, meaning the average view of a donor on maybe an economic issue is very different from the average issue of a voter for the two parties on various things. With also some issues where there wasn't a huge difference, but it's really interesting where there was a difference.
Yeah, and so let's focus in on what the issues are in particular, Zaid. What are the issues that the Republican donors and the liberal donors are most out of step with their own bases on?
Yes, that's a really good question. So for the Republicans, what they found is that on a range of economic issues like spending on poverty, taxes on the ultra wealthy, universal health care, Republican donors are actually much more conservative. They're much more kind of economic libertarian than the voters are. The voters tend to be more in favor of spending more money on poverty. They tend to be more in favor, or more generally favorable to raising taxes on the ultra rich. I think also they tend to be more for moderating kind of trade policy, things like that. And the Republican donors are more like where you actually see the Republican Party's lawmakers voting, right? Where you'd expect Republican senators, Republican House members to be, which is really interesting. When it comes to social issues, for the most part, the Republican donors and voters are not very far apart. The donors for the Republican side tend to be a little bit more conservative on gun control, which I think you can see in some respects when we poll Republicans on gun control. They're usually for like moderate type things like background checks, but the lawmakers generally aren't in favor of those things, and that may be a donor effect. The one group of people that's very, I think, very out of step on social issues is the Democratic donors versus the Democratic voters. Democratic donors tend to be much more in favor of unrestricted access to abortion, for instance, than Democratic voters are. They also tend to be much more strongly pro-gun control than Democratic voters are. And I think this is interesting because we often see lawmakers at the federal level or state level, I think, take positions that are closer to donors than they are to voters.
Right.
But no one has really ever comprehensively polled the donors. So this survey really kind of lets us know at least one snapshot of where the differences are between the two groups.
So useful.
It is so fascinating. To me, it goes hand in glove with a previous study that found essentially that that legislators in this town far more responsive to the wealthy than to the political preferences of your average voter. And this just sort of gets into more of the specifics as far as that is concerned. But you don't just lay out the problem here. You also talk about some potential solutions so that our legislators could be more responsive to the citizens. What did you find in that regard?
Yeah, so it's difficult because the Supreme Court and other courts have kind of ruled a lot of the campaign finance restrictions unconstitutional, like McCain-Feingold, so on and so forth with Citizens United. But one way you could potentially respond to this is by setting up alternative financing systems that kind of ordinary people can use. So for instance, the city of Seattle did this. They created something called the Democracy Voucher. Basically, the Democracy Voucher says anyone who's a resident of Seattle gets like $100, and they can donate to whoever they want in a city council election, municipal election, so on and so forth. That system has been used in a few cycles now, and people who've studied it have found that actually what it did is it increased the representation of kind of some of the more middle-class people and working-class people in terms of giving to candidates who normally wouldn't be able to give to candidates. And actually, some of the wealthier people use them less disproportionately compared to donating through the private system. There are still challenges there. For instance, a lot of a lot of the big money interests in Seattle actually moved their money to outside spending groups once they started limiting how much you could give directly to politicians. So, for instance, Amazon gave I think more than $500,000 or even more than that in the last election to outside groups attacking kind of populist members of the Seattle City Council. So there are still some challenges with that. But I think the democracy voucher system offers one way for people to kind of have a voice in a political process where really, right now, only a tiny portion of people are even act as small donors. Even a tiny portion of Americans would even give $100 to a politician running for office, let alone we're talking about some people who can afford to give millions of dollars, or someone like Michael Bloomberg who can spend $1 billion of his own dollars.
Mm-hmm. And broadly, Zed, I mean, what does it look like in terms of trying to build coalitions? Because one of the things we talk about here is, if you actually want to build a left-right coalition, does it show just that the sheer amount of money makes that, at least politically implausible, if not impossible?
Look, I think so, because the reality is if you poll people on a range of things, there's actually a lot of agreement. Like, if you poll people about raising minimum wage, about even Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax, you'll find a strong majority of Americans support those things, including sometimes up to half of Republican voters support some of those things, like the wealth tax or certain forms of raising a minimum wage, or readjusting trade policy, or cracking down on monopolies. Like, these things all poll very well because a lot of voters support them. But I think the reality is, if you're a member of Congress, you spend 20 or 30 hours a week on the phone raising money from people. You spend probably much more time talking to somebody you're raising money from than you are talking to your own constituents. And I think not only does that mean that you have to adjust yourself to their views to keep raising the money, but you probably psychologically start to think of those people as more important than your constituents. You start to reflect their point of view more than the point of view of maybe constituents, because you're talking to them all the time, because you're constantly on the phone or at a fundraiser, at a physical meeting. And I think that just having such an expensive political system where the elections take so long, in particular, I mean, many of our similar countries, like the UK, elections are very short, so they're very inexpensive to run because it's only a few weeks or a couple months or something like that. When we have elections that go on nonstop, and we have a year of campaigning, you have to raise so much money to be able to do these things. And if the donors have, on average, very different views from the voters, and the donors are polarized from each other, then you can't. It's actually very hard to make that consensus in that environment.
Great point.
Yeah, such a great point. So interesting to think about. Zed, thank you so much. Great to have you.
Thanks, Zed.
Yeah.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.